Hey everyone, we are back and we're going to be speaking about what happened to Constantinople after the conquest. How did Mehmed II change it? What really changed after all? When we last were speaking about the so-called conqueror, that is Mehmed II, Fatih Mehmed, who managed to conquer a city that had not been conquered by Muslims in over 800 years. And he finally managed to do it, albeit after the Ottomans controlled large portions of the surrounding area. But the real question really is, what did he do afterwards? As we pointed out before, there was already a tension between the frontier warriors who wanted to abandon the city and go back to Edirne and create that as the capital, and his new ambition to create a new capital for a new world empire. So let's think about this. What if you had just conquered a city like Constantinople, the seat of the Roman Empire, the city of the Byzantine Empire, for hundreds of years, and you now control the city? What would you do to it? What would you build? How would you preserve it? How would you treat the inhabitants? What would be your priorities? What would be the very first thing you built? Well, we can actually figure this out. One thing I want to point out is that it was clear from the beginning that Mehmed already intended, I think, to make this a capital city, right? He wanted it to be something major. For example, as I pointed out before, he only gave his troops 1 day to loot the city. Now, the usual rule of engagement is that if a city refuses to surrender, then the troops have 3 days to loot it. That's a lot of looting. And of course, whatever they find, they can take, and what people they take are enslaved. Now, he limited them to 1 day of looting. That means the city was not completely destroyed in that process. The other thing, there is this penjik, right? The penjik is the sultan's fifth of the share of any slaves or captives in any that they are taken over. Now the question is, what did he do with his share? He basically set them free, had them rebuild the city, and then paid them wages, and then asked them to settle back in their homes. So he's not taking them, selling them off, distributing the population. He realizes that he needs to recreate the population of the city. And why is that? Because the city essentially is very depopulated. From its height under the Byzantines, it had declined a long way. By the time Mehmed had taken it over, there was maybe 20,000 civilians, 30,000 civilians in it, very small, the size of maybe a medium-sized city. In contrast, Istanbul, Constantinople, by 1600 or by 1550s would be almost 400,000, 500,000 people. So a massive increase in people would come as it rose up from the dead. Now, he basically realized he had to repopulate the city. One of the things he did, he allowed the Greek inhabitants to live in his housing free of rent. He basically created a rent freeze or a rent amnesty. And then he, interestingly, did this event called the Surgun, that is kind of the forcible repopulation of the city by people living in other parts. So he rounded up Jews and Greek Christians living in other areas of the Ottoman Empire and forced them to resettle in Constantinople. He let them, of course, gave them tax benefits, etc., gave them housing, but the point is that he's creating a new city by moving people around. So what's interesting is that by the end of this period, he has a city that is actually 90% probably Greek-speaking, rather than a Turkish-speaking city. Now, keep this in mind because it actually will go into what kind of image he's going to project as a ruler in his future self. Now, we already also know that he, by conquering the city, gains a great amount of prestige and amount of power for doing basically what was seen to be impossible, or at least something that no one had done before. And he uses this new political capital to put through a set of reforms that had never been seen before. First and foremost, he basically destroys his group of viziers, the Chandarlus, a family of viziers that served the Ottoman for generations. He has them all executed, but he also executes the major generals of the frontier warriors. And in this power vacuum, he puts into effect a new group of people, basically raised through slavery, that is the kul, as we've been talking about, people who were former Byzantine elites, former princes of the Byzantine, and with them the slaves who were raised in the palace. He brings them in and turns them into the new elite, and they will be that way for at least another century and a half. The other interesting thing that he does is that he decides to appropriate Vakif property, Vakif lands. Now, what is Vakif? Do you remember we talked about it when we were speaking about how the Ottomans used Vakif, or endowments, to create new city infrastructure? So he basically seizes the endowment holdings of various families, endowments are independent but usually benefit certain families. And he also seizes private property. This is seen as a massive and completely illegal gesture, at least illegal according to Islamic law. But he was able to do it because of his capacity as a new conqueror. One of the other things he's doing, he's again cementing this distinction between askaris, that is military, and ra'aya, the flock, the people who pay the taxes. The askaris don't pay taxes, the ra'aya do. And interestingly, another kind of illegal practice that he did is basically officiate the practice of official fratricide. So we talked about how the Ottomans, already in the process of vying for succession, killed their brothers in a sort of quick civil war. But in this case, whenever a new sultan would come in, he would kill all of his brothers, even the ones that were children, right? So he kills, in this case, his baby brother. He eliminates them to eliminate any possible competition. And this, of course, creates a sort of gap between the moment that you kill the remaining male members of the dynasty and the fact that, and then when these male members have children themselves. So keep in mind all of these kind of new autocratic moves that Mehmed II is doing and transforming the empire into a much more centralized and different state. Now he's going to have to walk back on some of these, like the confiscation of Vakf and private property, but a lot of it is to create a new form of government. Now let's think about what is the first thing that he would do. And let's tour Constantinople after the conquest. This is the kind of earliest visual depiction we have of the city, probably from the 1480s, so about 20, 30 years after this period. This is the historical peninsula. These are the walls that go around the city. And we can see here that there's already been something built over here. This would be the palace, right? But the very first thing that he actually built was this fortress right at the end called Yedikule that we'll look at in a second. And over here is Pera Galata, the former Genoese colony that is now sort of its own in Peninsula. And here's another area called, this is the two fortresses that control the Bosphorus. You can even look closely and see the cannons firing from each side, showing how they control the passageway. And over here is this other area called Uskadar. Between these three things, this is kind of greater Istanbul. Now, let's look a bit closer and see what we can jump into. So the first thing is this part, Yedikule. Yedikule means 7 towers. It was essentially the very first thing he built. Now it makes sense because now you have a defensive position from which to defend the city. And interestingly about it is that if you look at it, it is made in this star shape. Why is this important? Because this is a new form of architecture taken from Renaissance Europe that allowed the defenders to deflect and fight off cannon fire, right? So in order to attack the weakest part of the walls, which are the center, the cannons would have to move in closer, at which point they would be um, subject to attacks from these towers. This ultimately became a very common form of fortification in early modern Europe, but at this point, this is the first known example of it being used, and it wasn't used in Europe. It was actually used in Constantinople under Mehmed II. So it was clear that he already had deep contacts with Europeans and European architecture at that time. Now let's go back to the map of Constantinople. Again, here is where the Yedikule would be, right at this corner. Here are the walls, which were then quickly repaired. The second thing, let me look at, this is what Yedikule would have looked like as a star-shaped fort, a bit clearer in these pictures and with these diagrams. But one of the second things that he did is he went out to commemorate the tomb of a Muslim from the first generation of Muslims, a man named Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, who supposedly led the first attack on Constantinople way back in the 680s or so, or 670s. Actually, yeah, maybe even earlier, 650s or so. He died attacking the walls, and one of his a Sufi sheikh that was very close to Sultan Mehmed II, Akshamuddin, essentially had a dream in which he discovered where exactly he was buried. That burial place right up here, right outside the walls of Constantinople in the north, is called Ayyub, named after Abu Ayyub. And it became a major pilgrimage site in Istanbul, and in fact it became the site of coronations for the sultans. And the moment the sultan was formally coronated, they would go up the Golden Horn, land here, and do the coronation ceremony. Today you can still actually can see in these miniatures the process of a sultan visiting Ayyub, and you can still go today and see actually a very similar set of tombs, which is a major site of popular adoration, captured in these photos of Ayyub by Araguler. These are from the 1950s, of course. Now it's changed a lot. It's very more touristy. By the way, if you're interested in the photos of Araguler, he captures, I think, the best aspects of Istanbul from the 20th century. He's a groundbreaking and important photographer globally, but also as an Armenian of Istanbul, he manages to capture many different aspects of Istanbul itself. He had a cafe in Istanbul until recently. He just died a few years ago. The next thing that Mehmed II sets up is a mosque. Now, he decides to actually build a mosque at the site of the Church of Holy Apostles, and he models it on the greatest church in front of him, which is the Church of Hagia Sophia, which we're going to look at next. Now, the important thing about Hagia Sophia is this dome. Now, you can't really see the first Fatih Jami, the first mosque of the Conqueror, because it collapsed. They couldn't build the dome correctly. And so after a few years, it collapsed, and then they had to rebuild it, I think in the 1480s or a bit afterwards. And the trick is basically, how do you create a gigantic dome, and can you make something bigger than Hagia Sophia? So after building it back, what he was trying to outdo is this gigantic church in the middle of Constantinople, actually right next to the the Byzantine palaces, and what would be close to the new Ottoman palaces. Now, if you were to go see this today, I mean, you have to see it. It is one of the most amazing sights in the world. It was, of course, upon the conquest of the city, converted into a mosque. Eventually, these minarets on the side were built, and today it's been actually reconverted into a mosque after being a museum for almost 100 years in the 20th century. So Hagia Sophia is over here. As we'll talk about, this is the Hippodrome. Here is where the palace, the Ottoman palace, will be. And here was Yetekule. Over here, Eyüp is over here. All of these areas, of course, is full of churches and other material. These are the different residential quarters of Istanbul. We shouldn't think of this as always just kind of deep urban space. This was full of gardens. People grew a lot of their food in cities. It was full of orchards, gardens, etc. And a few of them still remain around the edges of the walls here. This is, by the way, going back to Hagia Sophia. This is, you can see, try to get a sense of just the massive size of this dome and these massive walls that are built to kind of support it. And upon encountering it, you would have been amazed. I mean, once you enter it, it is just utterly breathtaking. Today, unfortunately, tourists can no longer enter from the bottom and kind of look up. They have to instead go on the stupid part in the balconies. But the rest of it is open if you buy a ticket stupidly. And you can go see Hagia Sophia. These giant medallions are the names of the first 4 caliphs and the name of God. These were added later in the 18th century. One of the interesting things is that there's still many remnants of the original Byzantine decoration. And in fact, during the first century, there was actually relatively few changes to the church itself. If we were to look at there's actually massive mosaics in gold and elsewhere throughout the loggia, or the upper part of the church / mosque, and these were not actually covered, at least for the first century. So when people would use it as a mosque, they would be still in this world, very clearly Christian world. Now, I can't show you this because this video is not going to work in this form of recording. But one of the interesting things is that the dome was so huge that the Hagia Sophia had a massive echo. It echoed for over 8 seconds. So you can imagine when monks were chanting in it, that it would reverberate over and over and over again. And it would create a sort of sonic sense of wonderment. And when people would experience this, especially pagans, they might be overwhelmed and kind of brought to Christianity. And I think that special sensory feeling of the space is important to try to capture. Now, speaking of the church and the transformation of the city, what happened to the actual Greek Orthodox Church? Because if you remember, the Byzantine capital was Constantinople was not just a political capital for the Byzantine Empire. It was also the seat of the Orthodox Church, right? The Catholic Church is in Rome, but the rest of the world believed that the site of orthodoxy was in Constantinople. Interestingly, Mehmed II, of course, he eliminated the Byzantines politically, but he decided to keep the church as an institution, and in fact, he formally recognized the leader of the church. He found a monk, Gennadius, who he kind of nominated to this position. He picked Gennadius because he was seen as against the union of the Latin and Orthodox churches, and he gave him an official appointment document, which you can see in this modern mosaic here, this kind of depiction of that. This is called, this official order or appointment document is called the Berat. And this kind of instituted a connection in which the Sultan, the government, approved the future patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church. And in doing so, it created a symbiotic relationship between the two, right? So the Orthodox Church was seen as a useful partner to help collect taxes to administer Christians, and to, in general, continue to help the legitimacy of this empire, which was still predominantly Christian at this time and would remain with a very large Christian minority up until the very end of the Ottoman Empire. So what you have is not the purposeful destruction of a church, but its kind of co-option and integration into the Ottoman system of government. Now, when we say that the patriarch is the head of Orthodox Christianity, what that actually means is that he didn't have full sway. He couldn't go to any sort of Orthodox subject and tell them what to do. He actually just had particular control over certain sees or districts, and what he did is essentially collect taxes. They collected taxes on these church estates, on the Christian population in these specific areas, and within these areas he was given the power to appoint and dismiss hierarchs, had authority over family law and divorce. He could control church property. He had the right to collect state taxes from Christians in these areas. But again, he wasn't sort of like king of all the Christians or patriarch of all the Christians. He just had connection or power over some areas. And this is just important to keep in mind, because if you look at some of the literature, it suggests that at this moment, and when Mehmed II appoints Gennadius, he's creating something called the Millet system, in which the Greeks emerged like an autonomous unit under the patriarch. And that's just not true. The patriarch was just given control over some areas. This, by the way, is the third or fourth major transformation that the city went to. This is what in the Byzantine Empire would have been called the hippodrome. It was where they would do the chariot racing, right? So at this point, the late Roman Empire, they are no longer doing gladiator battles, but they would do a lot of chariot racing, and the hippodrome is the main public site of spectacle in the city. And so in this hippodrome, you have a giant obelisk, you have different statues, including, look at this three-headed snake statue, etc. That hippodrome area will continue to be used by the Ottomans, and in fact, under the Byzantines, it was right next to the Great Palace. And you can actually see, and it was right next to Hagia Sophia. So if you go today to Istanbul, you go from outside of Hagia Sophia, you walk 5 minutes, and you get to the hippodrome. And you probably won't realize it's a hippodrome, but you'll see it's actually in the same structure. And over here, and where the Great Palace is another mosque, the Mosque of Sultan Ahmed. But you can still capture aspects of the Byzantine Palace in the Mosaic Museum. You can actually see the amazing floors of the Byzantine Palace today. And as I pointed out, under the Ottomans, the hippodrome continued to function as a public space of display, not for horse races, but for parades, executions, rebellions, other things. It continued to be the space in which people would line up, especially here, the dignitaries, including some Europeans over here, and the Sultan, line up and watch guild parades, other parades, festivities, etc. in the hippodrome. So keep that in mind.